The air in the grand lobby of the St. Regis Hotel smelt faintly of roses and old money. Guests glided in and out in glittering gowns and tailored suits, voices blending into the hum of clinking glasses and a live jazz quartet in the background. For most, it was just another Friday night in Manhattan's world of power and privilege. But for Lila Hart, standing frozen just inside the revolving doors, it felt like a battlefield. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She had told herself she'd never set foot in this hotel again, not after the humiliation she'd endured here 2 years ago. But tonight wasn't about the past. Tonight, she was here for her best friend's engagement party. A celebration Lila couldn't skip, even if every nerve in her body screamed at her to run. She adjusted the strap of her modest black dress, smoothed her trembling hands down the fabric, and took a deep breath. She was halfway to the ballroom when it happened. He was there. Ethan Vaughn. Her ex-husband. The man who had once vowed to love her until his last breath, only to shatter her world with cold precision. He stood at the far end of the lobby, effortlessly commanding attention in a charcoal suit, talking to a group of men who looked just as rich and dangerous as he did. His laughter rolled across the marble floor, warm and sharp at the same time. Lila's stomach dropped. She hadn't seen him in over a year. She'd thought time had dulled the edges of the wound he'd left, but seeing him now was like having the knife twisted all over again. She turned her face away, praying he wouldn't notice her. But then, as if drawn by some cruel magnetic pull, his gaze locked on hers. It was only for a second, but it was enough. That sharp, assessing stare, just like the day he told her she wasn't enough for the life he wanted, hit her like a punch to the chest. He started walking toward her, his long strides cutting through the crowd with predatory ease. Her mind raced. She couldn't bear the thought of him seeing her like this, alone, vulnerable, still haunted by him. She needed a shield. That's when she saw him. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stood a few feet away, his back to her. He was dressed in an impeccable navy suit, his posture relaxed, yet exuding a quiet authority. She didn't think, she acted. Closing the distance in 3 quick steps, Lila reached for his arm, spun him slightly toward her, and without warning, wrapped her arms around him. "I'm so glad you're here," she whispered urgently into his chest, her voice trembling. The man stiffened for a split second, then looked down at her. His eyes, deep, stormy gray, narrowed in curiosity, but he didn't pull away. Instead, his hand rested lightly on her back, his touch protective, almost possessive. "What's going on?" he murmured, his voice low and smooth, carrying a faint edge of amusement. "Please," she whispered, barely moving her lips. "Just pretend you know me. My ex is here." His gaze flicked over her head, scanning the crowd, and something unreadable passed through his expression. Then his lips curved into the faintest smile. "All right, play along then." To her shock, he tightened his arm around her waist and leaned in, close enough that his breath brushed her ear. "I'm not much of an actor," he said softly, "but I'm good at making things look real." Her heart stuttered. This was insane. She didn't even know his name. But in that moment, with Ethan's presence slicing through the air like a blade, this stranger felt like her only lifeline. Ethan reached them, his expression unreadable except for the faint crease between his brows. "Lila," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of charm and condescension, "didn't expect to see you here." Before she could respond, the stranger spoke. His tone was cool, measured. "Funny," he said, looking Ethan up and down. "I was about to say the same thing about you." The tension between the two men was instant, electric. Lila could feel it radiating through the air. She glanced between them, wondering what exactly she'd stepped into. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" The stranger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Someone who doesn't appreciate the way you're looking at her." It was a line straight out of a movie. The kind of thing Lila would have rolled her eyes at if she weren't currently clinging to him like a life raft. For a moment, Ethan seemed caught off guard. Then his smile returned, colder this time. "Well," Ethan said, "I suppose I should congratulate you, Lila. You've upgraded." The stranger's arm tightened slightly around her, his body a solid barrier between her and the man who had once broken her. "Oh, she's done more than that," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous murmur. Lila's breath caught. She didn't understand what he meant, but something in his tone made Ethan's smirk falter. It was subtle, But she saw it. The brief flash of uncertainty in the man who never let anyone see him sweat. For the first time in a long while, Leela felt a spark of control. She straightened her shoulders, her grip on the stranger's arm steady. "We should be going," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. The stranger nodded once, then guided her away without another glance at Ethan. They moved through the crowd together, his hand warm against her back, his presence a steady shield. She didn't know who he was or why he'd gone along with her desperate charade. But she knew one thing. She'd just crossed an invisible line, and nothing about tonight would end the way she'd planned. As they reached the elevator, the stranger pressed the call button and turned to her with that same faint, unreadable smile. "You have a habit of hugging random men in lobbies?" he asked. She almost laughed, the sound breaking through the haze of adrenaline. "Only when my past tries to ruin my night." The elevator doors slid open, and he gestured for her to step in first. As she did, she caught his reflection in the mirrored walls, a man perfectly at ease, yet somehow dangerous. The doors closed, cutting them off from the noise of the lobby. He extended his hand. "Nathaniel Cross," he said. "And you are?" "Lila," she replied, hesitating before adding, "Lila Hart." His gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if weighing the name, testing it. Then he smiled, slow, deliberate. "Well, Lila Hart, I have a feeling tonight's going to get interesting." She had no idea just how right he was, because Nathaniel Cross wasn't just a stranger. He was a billionaire, with a reputation for never letting go of what he wanted. Lila Hart hadn't always been the woman clutching a stranger's arm in a marble hotel lobby. Once she'd believed in fairy tales. Hers began in the most ordinary of places, a small town in upstate New York, where the nights were quiet, the winters long, and the tallest building was the county library. Her mother, a school teacher, had raised her alone after her father left when she was 3. Money was always tight, but their home was warm with laughter, books stacked high on every surface, and a garden that bloomed defiantly every spring. From a young age, Lila carried 2 things with her everywhere: a sketchbook and a dream. She loved to draw, anything from portraits to architectural details she saw in magazines. She imagined herself one day designing boutiques or quaint cafes, places where beauty and comfort met in perfect harmony. After high school, she scraped together scholarships and part-time jobs to attend a design program in the city. It was there, in her 2nd year, that she met Ethan Vaughn. He wasn't just handsome, he was magnetic. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that could turn a compliment into a promise, Ethan had the kind of charm that made people believe in him instantly. He claimed he worked in finance, though it quickly became clear he wasn't just some junior analyst. He took her to rooftop bars with sweeping views of Manhattan, to art galleries where everyone seemed to know his name, to restaurants where a single glass of wine cost more than her weekly groceries. Lila was dazzled. She told herself his world didn't intimidate her, that he saw something in her no one else did. When he told her she was different, she believed him. They married after a whirlwind year of dating. At first, life was a dream. Ethan encouraged her to quit her job and focus on building her own brand, though in reality he didn't like the idea of her working late or answering to anyone but him. He bought her dresses and jewelry, filled their apartment with expensive furniture, and whispered that she was his queen. But over time, the edges of the fairy tale began to fray. It started small. Comments about her wasting time on designs that weren't profitable, questions about why she needed to see friends he didn't know, suggestions that she should present herself better at his corporate events. Then came the larger cracks. Nights when he didn't come home until dawn, phone calls taken in hushed tones, unexplained charges on their credit card statements. Lila tried to ignore the signs, convincing herself he was just stressed from work. But one night, everything unraveled. She had been planning a quiet dinner for their anniversary. His favorite wine, candles, the pasta dish she'd learned from his mother. Ethan called an hour before he was due home to say he was caught up at a meeting. Something in his voice made her uneasy, so she decided to surprise him at his office. What she found was burned into her memory forever. Ethan in his glass-walled office, leaning against his desk, lips locked with a woman she had never seen before. The woman's hand was tangled in his tie, His was sliding up the back of her dress, and when Lila opened the door, he didn't even look guilty. He just straightened his jacket, smirked, and said, "This isn't what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like. The divorce that followed was swift and brutal. Ethan had powerful lawyers, and Lila, who'd given up her career and savings to be the wife he wanted, had almost nothing. In the settlement, she walked away with a small apartment, a battered savings account, and a broken heart. The months that followed were a blur of survival. She picked up freelance design jobs wherever she could, often working late into the night. Friends she thought she could count on drifted away, either uncomfortable with her new reality or unwilling to choose sides against Ethan. Her mother tried to help, but she was still a teacher in a small town. There was only so much she could do. Lila told herself she was healing. She told herself she was stronger now, that she had learned her lesson. But the truth was, she carried the humiliation like a weight, afraid to let anyone close enough to see the cracks. And then came the invitation to Claire's engagement party. Claire had been her roommate in college, the one person who had stood by her during the divorce. They didn't see each other often, but when Claire asked her to come, Lila couldn't say no. She wanted to be there for her friend, to show that she was moving on, even if she had to fake the confidence she no longer felt. The only problem? The party was being held at the St. Regis, a place Lila had once walked into on Ethan's arm, believing she belonged in his glittering world. Now, the thought of walking in alone made her stomach twist. Still, she told herself it would be fine. Ethan traveled constantly. What were the odds he would be there? As it turned out, the odds were exactly 100%. Seeing him again in that lobby had been like a nightmare made flesh. Every scar she thought had healed split open in an instant. The way his eyes scanned her, measuring her, calculating, was the same as the day he'd told her, "You'll never survive without me." And that was why, when she saw the tall man in the navy suit, she didn't hesitate. She didn't care if it was reckless or strange. She just needed to look untouchable for the 2 minutes it would take Ethan to pass her by. She had no idea that the man she'd clung to, Nathaniel Cross, was not only a billionaire, but someone whose life was as far from hers as the moon from the earth. She didn't know about the headlines his name commanded, the boardrooms he commanded, or the quiet ruthlessness behind his steady gaze. She just knew that for the first time in a long while, she'd felt protected. And now, standing in the mirrored elevator beside him, she realized she might have just stepped into a far more dangerous world than the one she'd escaped. Because Nathaniel Cross was about to make her an offer that would change everything. The elevator glided upward with the smooth silence that only the most expensive hotels could afford. Lila's pulse was still unsteady, but she kept her gaze fixed on the golden numbers above the door as they ticked higher. Beside her, Nathaniel Cross stood with a stillness that was oddly commanding, one hand in his pocket, the other loosely holding his phone. When the doors opened, they stepped out into the mezzanine level leading to the Grand Astoria ballroom. The air up here seemed different, cooler, crisper, carrying the faint scent of lilies and polished wood. The first thing Lila noticed was the light. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the high coffered ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over the room. Each one sparkled with hundreds of hand-cut prisms, and their reflection danced across the marble floors. The walls were dressed in deep emerald drapes, framing enormous windows that looked out onto the glittering Manhattan skyline. Waiters in immaculate black vests glided between tables, balancing silver trays of champagne flutes and bite-sized delicacies that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a mouth. The tables themselves were covered in white linen, so fine it looked almost liquid, each crowned with a centerpiece of white roses and cascading orchids. The room buzzed with conversation, a low hum of old money and calculated ambition. Men in perfectly tailored suits clustered together near the bar, their laughter carrying the kind of confidence that came from knowing you owned more than most people could dream of. Women in gowns worth more than a year's rent air-kissed over the rims of crystal glasses, their jewelry flashing under the lights like secret signals. Lila felt the old sensation creeping in, the mix of awe and alienation she'd felt during her marriage to Ethan. This was his world. A world where appearances weren't just important, they were everything. Every glance was measured, every handshake weighed, every smile hiding a transaction. Nathaniel walked beside her with the ease of someone who not only belonged here but could buy and sell the room 10 times over. His presence drew glances, curious, appraising, and in some cases, downright speculative. Lila noticed women's eyes lingering on him a little longer than polite conversation allowed. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he just didn't care. They reached the far side of the ballroom, where a quartet played something soft and sophisticated. Claire spotted Lila from across the room and waved, her diamond engagement ring catching the light. Lila smiled back, grateful for the familiar face. She started toward her friend, but Nathaniel's hand lightly touched her elbow. "You said your ex is here," he murmured. "Where?" She hesitated, then tilted her head subtly toward the center of the room. Ethan stood near a cluster of donors, his arm resting on the back of a chair, in a way that looked casual but was anything but. He was laughing at something a man beside him said, but his eyes flicked over to Lila and Nathaniel. The glance was quick, too quick for anyone else to notice, but it made Lila's stomach tighten. Ethan didn't just see her. He was assessing, recalculating, the way he used to when she'd surprised him in some small way. Nathaniel followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "He's watching you." "I know," she said quietly. He looked back at her, and for a moment she thought he might ask more, but instead he smiled faintly. "Good. Let him." Before she could ask what he meant, a waiter appeared with 2 flutes of champagne. Nathaniel took them both, handing one to her. "You might as well look like you're enjoying yourself," he said, his tone light but edged with something else. Something strategic. They moved through the crowd together, stopping occasionally when someone greeted Nathaniel. Lila noticed that people didn't just greet him, they deferred to him. Even men twice his age seemed to straighten their posture and choose their words carefully. Whatever his exact place in this glittering hierarchy was, it was near the top. Claire joined them, practically glowing. "Lila, you look amazing." She leaned in for a hug, then turned to Nathaniel. "And you must be?" "Nathaniel Cross," he said, shaking her hand. Claire blinked, recognition dawning in her eyes. "As in Cross Industries," he gave a small nod. "Guilty." Claire shot Lila a look that said, "We're going to talk about this later," but the moment was interrupted by a ripple of motion near the center of the room. A tall man in a navy suit, different shade than Nathaniel's, stepped up to the microphone on the small stage at the front. His voice carried easily over the murmur of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for the annual Hearts for Hope Charity Gala." The speech continued, all warm words about generosity and community, but Lila barely heard it. Her eyes kept finding Ethan. He was still watching her, though now his expression had shifted, less surprise, more calculation. The moment the applause started, Ethan began making his way toward them. The crowd seemed to part for him, like they always had when he was moving toward something he wanted. Nathaniel noticed. Without a word, he shifted slightly, angling his body so that when Ethan arrived, Lila was standing just half a step behind him, shielded from direct view. "Lila," Ethan said smoothly when he reached them. His smile was polite, his eyes anything but. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." "Surprise," she said, her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. Ethan's gaze flicked to Nathaniel. "And you are?" "Nathaniel Cross," he said evenly. Recognition flickered in Ethan's eyes. "Ah, I've heard of you." "I'm sure you have," Nathaniel replied, his tone mild but edged with steel. The 2 men stood there for a moment, the tension stretching between them like a live wire. Lila could feel the weight of eyes on them from nearby guests. Claire reappeared at her side, chatting breezily to fill the silence, but Lila's attention stayed locked on Ethan. She could see the question forming behind his smile. What is she doing with him? And for the first time, she didn't mind him wondering. Nathaniel broke the silence first. "If you'll excuse us," he said, his hand settling lightly at the small of Lila's back. "We have somewhere to be." He guided her away without waiting for Ethan's response. They crossed the room, leaving the hum of speculation in their wake. Only when they reached the quieter hallway outside the ballroom did Lila let out the breath she'd been holding. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. Nathaniel glanced at her. "Yes," he said, "I did." And that was when Lila realized Nathaniel Cross hadn't just stepped in to help her. He'd just declared a silent war on Ethan Vaughn. Ethan Vaughn was the kind of man who could make a room stop breathing when he walked in. It wasn't just his height or the broad set of his shoulders or even the sharp planes of his face that photographers loved. It was the way he carried himself. Like the rules didn't apply to him because in his world, they didn't. He'd built his empire on that very belief. Born to a wealthy family in Connecticut, Ethan had been groomed for success from birth. His father was a hedge fund manager with a Rolodex that could move markets. His mother was an heiress who specialized in social events that doubled as power brokering opportunities. Ethan had inherited their looks, their connections, and their ruthless understanding of how the world really worked. In college, he'd been the golden boy, captain of the rowing team, president of his fraternity, the guy professors remembered because he could talk his way into extensions and extra credit without ever seeming desperate. By the time he was 30, he'd leveraged his family's influence into a career in high-stakes investment banking, specializing in corporate takeovers. Ethan didn't just close deals, he consumed them. Companies folded under his strategy, rivals crumbled, and every victory made him more untouchable. In the glossy business magazines, he was hailed as a visionary. But behind the champagne toasts and the tailored suits, he was something far less glamorous, a man who believed winning was the only thing worth caring about, and people were just pieces on the board. Lila had learned that the hard way. When they first met, Ethan had been all charm and gallantry, sweeping her into a life she'd never imagined. He told her he admired her ambition, her creativity. He bought her sketchbooks and whispered about the design firm they'd start together one day. But once the ring was on her finger, the admiration curdled into criticism. "You don't really understand this world," he'd say when she questioned a decision. Or, "You're too sensitive. In my business, you have to be willing to play hard." It wasn't long before the criticism turned into control. He'd comment on what she wore. Too plain, too flashy, not the right designer for the crowd they were seeing. He'd accidentally forget to mention events until the last minute, so she had no time to prepare. And when she succeeded at something on her own, like getting a freelance design project published in a local magazine, he'd brush it off as cute, but unimportant. The night she caught him with another woman had been the end of their marriage, but not the end of his reach. Even after the divorce, Ethan made sure she felt his presence. Mutual friends accidentally passed along his digs, how she was struggling, how she'd never make it without him. When she tried to pick up clients in the design world, she found doors quietly closing. She didn't have proof, but she knew Ethan was behind it. Ethan's cruelty wasn't loud. It was deliberate, strategic. He never raised his voice. He never looked angry in public. He could ruin someone's reputation with a single sentence over dinner, all while smiling and toasting to their continued success. Tonight, at the St. Regis, Lila could feel that same quiet threat radiating off him. From the moment Nathaniel Cross put himself between them in the ballroom, Ethan's demeanor had shifted. To anyone else, he looked calm, even amused. But Lila recognized the subtle signs, the way his jaw tensed just before he smiled, the calculating glint in his eyes. Ethan wasn't the kind of man to be publicly challenged without consequences, and Nathaniel had just done exactly that. What unsettled her most was the fact that she couldn't read his plan yet. Ethan never acted without one. Nathaniel, on the other hand, seemed unbothered. After their exchange with Ethan, he'd walked her toward a quiet corner, stopping to greet a few people on the way, as if nothing had happened. But Lila could feel it in the air. The shift in the room, the whispers starting, the ripple effect that always followed when powerful men crossed paths. And she knew Ethan well enough to know he wouldn't let it end with a polite nod and a drink. "Your ex," Nathaniel said after a moment, glancing toward where Ethan now stood talking to another group, "likes to be the center of the room." "That's one way of putting it," Lila replied, trying to keep her tone light. Nathaniel studied her for a moment. "What did he do to you?" She hesitated. Part of her wanted to shrug it off, to keep her history locked away, where Ethan couldn't use it against her again. But Nathaniel's gaze was steady, not prying so much as waiting. "He taught me," she said finally. That some people only see you for what you can give them, and once you're no longer useful, you're disposable. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice stayed even. And yet you're here, in the same room as him. For a friend, she said. Not for him. Nathaniel's eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan again. Good, because men like that, when they lose control, they tend to get creative. The implication wasn't lost on her. Across the room, Ethan laughed at something one of his companions said, but his eyes found Lila again. This time, he didn't look away. He raised his glass in a slow, mocking toast. The gesture was small enough that no one else might notice, but it was meant for her alone. She felt that old, familiar dread stir in her chest. Ethan was telling her he still had the upper hand, that no matter who she stood beside tonight, he could still reach her. Nathaniel noticed her reaction. Ignore him, he said quietly. That's not how it works with Ethan, she replied. Nathaniel's lips curved into something that was almost a smile, but there was nothing warm in it. Then maybe it's time someone showed him how it works with me. For a moment, Lila didn't know what to say. She'd only just met Nathaniel, yet here he was, talking about stepping into a battle she'd been fighting alone for years. The problem was, battles with Ethan weren't just won or lost, they were survived. And she wasn't sure anyone could come out unscathed. And then, as if to prove her fears right, Ethan Vaughn started walking toward them again, this time with a very deliberate smile. Ethan's approach was slow, unhurried, the way a predator might circle prey it already knew couldn't escape. The murmur of conversation in the ballroom barely masked the subtle shift in energy. Lila felt it before she saw it. The way people began glancing over their champagne flutes, whispering behind manicured hands. Nathaniel, standing beside her, didn't move. If anything, his posture grew even more relaxed, his hand still resting at the small of her back. A silent message that she wasn't standing alone. Lila, Ethan greeted when he finally reached them, his smile polished to perfection. I didn't get a proper introduction earlier. His gaze flicked to Nathaniel. Though I think I know who you are. Nathaniel met his stare with calm disinterest. Then I won't waste time telling you. The tension between them could have cut glass. Ethan's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. Still, he continued, we should be civilized. After all, Lila and I share history. He let the word linger just long enough to make it sound intimate, deliberate. Lila braced herself. Ethan rarely made a move without an audience, and she could feel one gathering now. Donors, socialites, even a few journalists hovering near the edge of the conversation. He turned slightly, gesturing toward a passing waiter. Champagne for the lady, Ethan said smoothly before adding with faux concern. Or, are you still avoiding alcohol these days, Lila? The implication was immediate, and it wasn't lost on the crowd. Whispers flitted through the air like sparks. Lila's stomach tightened. He was bringing up something private. Her decision to avoid alcohol during a period of health issues, as if it were a weakness. Nathaniel's hand at her back pressed slightly, steadying her. I'm fine, Lila said evenly, though her pulse was racing. Thank you. Ethan smiled like a man who'd scored a point. Of course, you've always been careful. Sometimes too careful. But I suppose that's what happens when you're not cut out for. Enough. Nathaniel's voice cut through Ethan's words like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. If you have something to say to her, say it without the innuendo. Or better yet, don't say it at all. A ripple went through the onlookers. Public confrontations at these kinds of events were rare, and they were blood in the water for this crowd. Ethan's eyes narrowed. I'm just catching up with an old friend. Nathaniel took a deliberate step closer, his voice calm but cold. From where I'm standing, it looks more like you're trying to embarrass her in front of half the city, which tells me you're either very insecure or very stupid. The silence that followed was electric. Lila's heart pounded, not just from the words, but from the way Nathaniel delivered them, with complete, unshakable control. Ethan's jaw flexed, but he smiled again, though now it looked strained. Careful, Cross. You don't know me. I don't need to, Nathaniel replied, his gaze unwavering. I know enough. For a moment no one moved. Then Ethan chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Well, he said, I wouldn't want to keep you from whatever this is. His eyes slid over Lila, a silent promise that this wasn't over. Enjoy your evening. He turned and walked away, the crowd subtly parting for him. But the damage was done, not to Lila, but to his own carefully crafted image. People had seen him challenged, and more importantly, they'd seen him walk away. Lila exhaled slowly, only now realizing how tightly she'd been gripping her champagne flute. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. Nathaniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I did." He's used to controlling the narrative. Sometimes you have to remind people that they're not the only ones who can set the tone. Before she could respond, Claire appeared at her side, eyes wide. "What was that?" she whispered. "Do you have any idea how many people just saw that exchange? Ethan Vaughn doesn't get talked to like that, ever." Lila opened her mouth to answer, but the sound of a microphone tapping filled the room. A man in a tuxedo stepped onto the stage, smiling broadly. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. It's time for the charity auction." The crowd shifted toward the front, eager to see what treasures would go under the hammer. Nathaniel guided Lila toward a pair of seats near the center, his hands still at her back. She could feel the eyes on them, the speculation in every glance. As the auctioneer began, Lila tried to focus on the items being presented: exotic vacations, rare wines, signed memorabilia, but she could sense Ethan somewhere behind her, watching, waiting. Halfway through, the auctioneer unveiled the centerpiece item: a week-long stay at a private villa in the Amalfi Coast, complete with a yacht and personal chef. Bidding started high and climbed quickly. 200,000, a man called from the back. 250, another countered. The numbers soared: 300, 350, until Ethan's voice rang out. 500,000. A murmur swept the room. The auctioneer smiled. 500,000, do I hear? 1 million, Nathaniel said. His voice calm, almost bored. The room went still. Even the auctioneer hesitated before repeating, 1 million from Mr. Nathaniel Cross. Ethan's expression was unreadable, but his eyes locked on Nathaniel's. After a beat, he gave a tight smile and leaned back in his chair, conceding. The gavel came down. The audience applauded, but Lila's mind was spinning. That wasn't just a bid, it was a message. As the applause faded, Nathaniel leaned toward her, his voice low. "Sometimes the easiest way to win is to make sure the other man can't." Lila didn't know whether to laugh or worry. "You just spent $1 million to prove a point?" His eyes met hers. "I'd spend more." Before she could respond, a shadow fell over their table. She looked up to see Ethan, his smile back in place, his tone pleasant enough to fool anyone who didn't know him. "Congratulations on your win," he said to Nathaniel. Then, to Lila, "I'll see you before the night's over." And with that, he walked away, leaving Lila with the chilling certainty that whatever came next would not be in front of an audience. The moment the gala ended, Lila slipped away. Nathaniel had offered to walk her out, but she'd insisted she was fine, claiming she needed a few minutes to say goodbye to her friend Claire. In truth, she just needed space. Space to breathe, space to think, space to quiet the pounding in her head. The grand lobby of the St. Regis was quieter now, the crowd thinning as the last guests trickled out into the night. Lila moved toward a shadowed alcove near the side entrance, her heels clicking softly against the marble. She leaned back against the cool wall and closed her eyes. The entire evening replayed in her mind like a reel she couldn't pause. Ethan's smug smile, his calculated jabs, the way the crowd leaned in for every word. And Nathaniel, steady, unflinching, throwing himself between her and a man he'd only just met. It should have made her feel safer. Instead, it left her unsettled, because she knew how Ethan operated. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Public challenges didn't roll off him. They festered, turned into strategies, sharpened into knives. And now, Nathaniel had put himself directly in Ethan's line of fire. She rubbed her arms, suddenly chilled despite the warm air. Running away already? Her eyes flew open. Ethan stood just a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed as if they were two old friends catching up. "I'm leaving," she said flatly. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conversational murmur. "You've changed, Lila. Used to be, you'd at least pretend to be polite. I stopped pretending a long time ago." Ethan's smile didn't waver, and yet here you are, at my event. "It wasn't your event," she shot back. "It was a charity gala." His eyes glinted. "Funded by my firm. Organized by people I choose. You really think you can move in these circles without running into me?" The implication was clear. This was still his world and she was trespassing. "You don't control where I go," she said, though her voice wasn't as steady as she wanted. Ethan leaned in slightly, enough that only she could hear. "I control more than you think, and this thing with Cross, whatever game you're playing, don't. You won't win." Before she could respond, he stepped back, offered a mock salute, and walked away. Lila's hands were trembling. She hated that he could still get to her, that his words could still scrape against the old wounds she thought had healed. She needed air. Outside, the city was alive with the usual chaos. Taxis honking, neon signs flashing, the faint scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. She walked quickly, not caring where she was going, just putting distance between herself and the hotel. By the time she reached her apartment, her feet ached, and her dress felt like it weighed 100 pounds. She dropped her clutch on the kitchen counter and sank onto the couch, staring at the dark window. The adrenaline from earlier had drained away, leaving only exhaustion. She thought about calling Claire, but she didn't want to explain the scene with Ethan, not tonight. She thought about calling her mother, but she didn't want to hear the worry in her voice. Instead, she poured herself a glass of water and tried to focus on her breathing. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number lit up the screen. "You looked good tonight." Her stomach dropped. She didn't need to guess who it was from. She deleted the message without replying, but the unease lingered. It wasn't until nearly midnight that there was a knock at her door. She froze. No one visited her this late. When she peered through the peephole, she saw Nathaniel. She opened the door, frowning. "How do you know where I live?" He gave a small shrug. "You left your clutch at the hotel. Thought you might want it back." He held it out. She took it, feeling suddenly self-conscious in her loose sweater and leggings. "You could have given it to Claire." "I could have," he agreed. "But I wanted to make sure you were all right." She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Do you want to come in?" Nathaniel entered, glancing briefly around her modest apartment. If he noticed the mismatched furniture or the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, he didn't comment. "You left in a hurry," he said. "I didn't want to make a scene," she replied. He studied her for a moment. "Ethan spoke to you after the gala. It wasn't a question." "Yes," she admitted. "And before you ask, no, I don't want to talk about it." Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Fair enough. But you should know, he's already asking questions about me, about us." Lila's stomach twisted. "There is no us." His gaze didn't waver. Not yet. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she looked away. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I don't like bullies," he said simply, "and your ex-husband fits the bill." She almost laughed, but it came out brittle. "You don't know him, Nathaniel. He doesn't fight fair. He won't come at you directly. He'll go after anything he thinks matters to you." Nathaniel stepped closer. "Then he's about to find out that nothing matters to me more than protecting what I want." The words sent a shiver through her. Not fear exactly, but something more complicated. She opened her mouth to respond, but her phone buzzed again. Another text from the same unknown number. "We should have a proper talk, just you and me. Tomorrow night." Nathaniel saw the screen over her shoulder. "Ethan?" She didn't answer, but her silence was enough. He took the phone gently from her hand, typed a reply without asking, and hit send. "What did you just do?" she demanded. "I told him we'll see him tomorrow," Nathaniel said calmly. "Together." And in that moment, Lila realized that whatever tomorrow brought, it wouldn't just be her fight anymore. It would be theirs. The next evening arrived faster than Lila expected. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying every possible version of what could happen when they met Ethan. Some ended in shouting, others in icy threats, and the worst ended with her walking away even more trapped than before. Nathaniel, however, seemed unbothered. When he arrived at her apartment to pick her up, he was dressed in a charcoal suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression calm. "You ready?" he asked, as though they were heading to a casual dinner instead of stepping into a confrontation with one of the most manipulative men she'd ever known. "No," she admitted, grabbing her coat. "But I guess that doesn't matter now." They drove in silence for a while, the city lights streaking across the windows of Nathaniel's sleek black car. Finally, Lila couldn't take it anymore. "You never told me why you're doing this," she said. "Why do you care what Ethan does to me? We barely know each other." Nathaniel's eyes stayed on the road. Because I know the kind of man he is. I've seen it before. In business? She asked. In life, he replied. There was something in his tone, something weightier than casual disdain, that made her turn toward him. You've met him before. Nathaniel didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was measured. My father owned a mid-sized tech company about 10 years ago. We weren't giants, but we were profitable. Ethan's firm came in under the guise of an investment partnership. My father trusted them, trusted him. 6 months later, the company was stripped for parts, sold off to Ethan's associates, and my father was forced to declare bankruptcy. Lila's chest tightened. That's legal, Nathaniel finished, his jaw tightening, and calculated. My father died 2 years later, heart failure, but I know what really killed him. Lila stared at him, the puzzle pieces clicking into place. So this isn't just about me. It's about stopping him, Nathaniel said. And you're the one person I've seen stand up to him and survive, even if you don't feel like it. She shook her head. I didn't survive. I barely made it out. Then maybe it's time you do more than survive. The car pulled up outside a private club, one of those places without a sign, where the real deals were made over aged whiskey and whispered promises. Inside, the lighting was low, the air heavy with the scent of leather and expensive cigars. A host in a dark suit led them to a private room in the back. Ethan was already there, sitting at a polished mahogany table, a glass of scotch in his hand. Right on time, he said smoothly. I almost thought you'd lose your nerve. Nathaniel didn't sit immediately. Let's get something straight. We're here because you asked for this meeting. Whatever you have to say it to both of us. Ethan's gaze shifted between them, lingering on Lila just long enough to make her skin crawl. I wanted to give you some friendly advice, he said. You're walking into something you don't understand. Lila kept her voice steady. What exactly am I walking into, Ethan? You? He smiled faintly. You know I could make things very difficult for you. Your clients, your apartment, even your mother. It wouldn't take much. Nathaniel's hand curled into a fist on the table. If you threaten her family, we'll have a problem. Ethan chuckled. We already have a problem, Cross. I know exactly who you are, the angry son of a man who didn't know how to protect what he built. You think buying a few companies and throwing your money around makes you untouchable? I've buried bigger men than you. Nathaniel finally sat, leaning forward. And yet here you are, making an effort to meet me face to face. That doesn't sound like a man who's in control. That sounds like someone who's afraid they're losing it. Ethan's smile tightened. Careful. No, Nathaniel said evenly. You be careful. You've built your entire life on the assumption that no one will stand up to you. That changes now. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Lila could feel her own heartbeat in her throat. Ethan's eyes flicked to her again. You really think this man is your savior, Lila? Men like Nathaniel, they always have an angle. Trust me, I've been one. Lila met his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't look away. Maybe he does have an angle, but at least he's not pretending to be something he's not. Ethan leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. You've gotten bolder. I wonder how long that will last when you realize the cost. Nathaniel stood. The cost will be yours, not hers. For a moment, the three of them sat in a tense triangle of silence. Then Ethan smirked. We'll see. When they left the club, the cool night air felt almost sharp. Lila wrapped her coat tighter around herself, her mind spinning. In the car, she turned to Nathaniel. Why didn't you tell me before? About your father? He kept his eyes on the road. Because I didn't want you to think I'm using you as a pawn. This is your life, your fight. I'm just choosing to be in it. And if I don't want you in it, she asked quietly. Too late, he said, his voice almost gentle. I'm already here. They drove in silence for a few blocks before Nathaniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression darkening. What is it? Lila asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed her the phone. On the screen was a photo, her mother's house, taken that night. Her blood ran cold, and in that instant, Lila knew Ethan's next move had already begun. The photo of her mother's house burned in Lila's mind all night. She barely slept, each creak in her apartment making her jolt awake, expecting the phone to buzz again with another message from Ethan. By sunrise, the fear had stopped buzzing through her veins and hardened into something else, anger. Not the helpless, shaky kind she'd felt after the divorce, but something sharp and steady. Ethan had crossed a line. She wasn't going to sit and wait for him to make the next move. Nathaniel was already in her kitchen when she came out of her bedroom, wearing one of his immaculate suits and sipping coffee like he owned the place. "You have a key now?" she asked dryly. He set the cup down. "You gave it to me last night when you went looking for your charger." She frowned, trying to remember, then shook her head. "Never mind. We need to talk." "Agreed," he said. Because that photo wasn't just a warning, it was a test. He wanted to see how you'd react. "Well, I'm done reacting," Lila said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I want to hit back." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Good. But if we're going to do that, we're going to do it my way." "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, "that you stop letting him dictate how you move, how you look, how you think. You've been playing defense since the day you met him. That ends now." She crossed her arms. "And what exactly does your way involve?" Nathaniel's mouth curved into the faintest smile. "First, we change the way you walk into a room." 2 hours later, Lila found herself standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror in a private showroom belonging to a designer she'd only seen in magazines. Dresses in jewel tones and sleek cuts hung around her, each one more stunning than the last. "I don't need a new wardrobe to deal with Ethan," she muttered, tugging at the neckline of a midnight blue gown. "No," Nathaniel agreed, "but you need to remind yourself, and him, that you are not the woman he broke." The words landed heavier than she expected. She turned back to the mirror, studying the way the gown draped over her frame, the way the color brought out the green in her eyes. She barely recognized herself, but for the first time in a long time, she liked what she saw. By the time they left, the showroom had sent half a dozen outfits to her apartment. Nathaniel didn't blink at the bill. The next step wasn't about clothes. That afternoon, Nathaniel brought her to one of his offices, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a panoramic view of the city. There, he introduced her to two people, a cybersecurity specialist named Maya and a private investigator named Colin. "Maya will make sure your devices are clean," Nathaniel explained. "No tracking, no listening. Colin's going to dig into Ethan's recent activities. We're not just going to protect you, we're going to find leverage." Lila felt a flicker of unease. "This is starting to sound dangerous." "It already is," Nathaniel said simply. "The only difference now is that you'll be ready." For the rest of the afternoon, she worked with Maya to secure her phone, laptop, and even her apartment's Wi-Fi. Colin asked careful questions about Ethan, his habits, his contacts, his pressure points. The process was exhausting, but with every step, Lila felt a little less like prey and a little more like a participant in her own life. That evening, Nathaniel drove her to a rooftop bar in the heart of Manhattan. The skyline glowed around them, the air crisp with the promise of winter. "Why here?" she asked, stepping toward the edge to take in the view. "Because tomorrow night," Nathaniel said, joining her, "Ethan's going to see you like this, confident, untouchable, and he's going to realize he's lost control." Lila took a deep breath. What if he doesn't care? What if he just escalates? Nathaniel's gaze was steady. "Then we'll be ready for that too. But you need to understand something, Lila. This isn't just about making him back off. This is about you taking back the pieces of yourself he tried to erase." The words settled into her like a promise. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the city spread out beneath them. Then Nathaniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression tightening just slightly before he slipped it back into his pocket. "What was that?" she asked. "Nothing you need to worry about tonight," he said. "Just focus on tomorrow." Back at her apartment, Lila tried on one of the new dresses again. It was a deep emerald silk, the fabric catching the light with every movement. She practiced walking in it, holding her head high, her shoulders back. She thought about all the times Ethan had told her she was too plain, too timid, too small to matter. And with each step across the room, she felt those words lose a little more of their power. She didn't know exactly what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she wasn't going to face it the same way she had before. Because tomorrow, she wouldn't just be standing next to Nathaniel Cross. She would be standing as Lila Hart, and Ethan Vaughn was going to see that for himself. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a calendar invite from Nathaniel. Tomorrow, 8 p.m., Hotel Belmont, ballroom level. She stared at it for a long moment before hitting accept. And as she set the phone down, Lila knew there was no turning back. The war with Ethan was about to go public. The Hotel Belmont was even more opulent than the St. Regis. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and light, with gilded columns and a massive chandelier dripping crystals like frozen rain. Lila stepped out of the car with Nathaniel at her side, every camera flash from the waiting press bouncing off her emerald silk gown. For once, she didn't flinch. She lifted her chin, meeting the lenses head-on. Nathaniel's hand rested lightly at her back, steady and certain, but she no longer needed it for balance. She felt solid in her own skin. Inside, the ballroom was already buzzing. Tonight's guest list was a who's who of finance, politics, and high society. Waiters glided past with champagne, and a string quartet filled the air with music so refined it almost vanished into the chatter. Ethan was there. Of course he was. She spotted him near the center of the room, surrounded by admirers, his tailored suit immaculate, his smile smooth as glass. When his gaze landed on her, the faintest flicker of surprise crossed his face. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by the calculating mask she knew too well. "Ready?" Nathaniel murmured. "As I'll ever be," she replied. Their plan had been simple in concept, but risky in execution. Colin, the investigator, had unearthed documents showing Ethan's firm's involvement in a series of shell companies tied to offshore accounts. Accounts that had been quietly siphoning charity funds from events like this one. Maya had prepared the presentation. Nathaniel had arranged for the right people to be in the room. All Lila had to do was stand her ground when the moment came. They didn't have to wait long. An announcer stepped to the stage, welcoming everyone and thanking the event's key patrons, among them Ethan Vaughn. Polite applause followed, and Ethan stepped forward to accept the recognition, his voice dripping charm as he spoke about giving back to the community. Nathaniel caught Lila's eye and gave the smallest nod. Her cue. She moved to the edge of the stage, her heels silent against the polished floor. When Ethan concluded his speech and started to step down, she took the microphone. "Before we continue," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd, "I think it's important the people here tonight know exactly where some of their donations have been going." A ripple of confusion swept the room. Ethan froze mid-step, turning toward her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Lila," he said smoothly, "I don't think this is the—" "It's exactly the time," she cut in. Nathaniel signaled to a technician in the back, and the screens flanking the stage lit up. Documents appeared. Scanned contracts, bank transfers, corporate registrations. Maya had highlighted the key points, the shell companies, the matching offshore accounts, the dates that lined up perfectly with several high-profile charity events. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ethan's smile faltered. "These are baseless accusations." "They're facts," Nathaniel said from the floor, his voice cutting through the noise. "Verified by independent auditors. You've been using charity events to launder money, Ethan. And you've been doing it for years." The crowd erupted, some people whispering, others pulling out their phones. The event's host looked pale, glancing between Ethan and the screen as if unsure what to do. Ethan stepped toward Lila, lowering his voice. "You have no idea what you've just done." "Oh, I do," she said quietly. "I took back the power you've been stealing from people for years, including me." Security began to move closer, unsure if they were there to protect Ethan or remove him. Nathaniel came up beside her, his presence a wall between her and Ethan. "The authorities are already on their way," he said evenly. "You won't talk your way out of this one." Ethan's mask cracked for the first time that night. "You think this makes you safe?" he hissed at Lila. "You think this ends with me walking out of here in cuffs? You have no idea how deep this goes." "Maybe not," she replied, "but I know it's deeper than you can climb out of." The doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Two men in dark suits entered, flashing badges. They moved straight toward Ethan, speaking to him quietly before leading him away through the sea of watching eyes. The room was silent, except for the click of cameras and the low murmur of speculation. Lila's knees felt unsteady, but she held her head high. Nathaniel took the microphone from her hand and addressed the crowd. Tonight was meant to be about generosity and trust. Let's make sure it still is. The funds from this event will go where they're supposed to go. To the people who need them most. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger. When they finally stepped off the stage, Lila felt a rush of adrenaline so strong she had to steady herself on Nathaniel's arm. "You did it," he murmured. "We did it," she corrected. But as they left the ballroom, weaving through the crowd, she caught sight of a man lingering near the exit. Someone she didn't recognize, watching her with unnerving intensity. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. He just stood there, tracking her every move. Nathaniel noticed him too. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Who is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," he said. "But I don't think he's here for the horse doves." And in that moment, Lila realized that taking down Ethan might have just opened the door to something even more dangerous. The man at the exit in the Hotel Belmont had followed them into the street. Nathaniel subtly guided Lila toward his car, his arm protective but not panicked. The night air was sharp, each step clicking against the pavement like a countdown. The man didn't speed up, didn't call out, he just walked, always keeping the same distance. When they reached the car, Nathaniel opened the door for Lila but didn't get in himself. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Nathaniel?" But he was already turning, walking toward the stranger. The two men stopped a few feet apart. Their voices were low, but Lila caught pieces of it through the open car window. "Not here for trouble. Working for investigation. You should have called first." A moment later, Nathaniel returned, sliding into the driver's seat. "He's FBI," he said simply, starting the engine. Lila blinked. "FBI?" They'd been watching Ethan for months. Tonight was just the final push they needed. Relief rippled through her, loosening a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. But Nathaniel's jaw was still tight, his focus sharp on the road ahead. "What is it?" she asked. "They're going to need you," he said. "Your testimony, your evidence, all of it. And once you go on record, there's no going back." Lila thought about the years she'd spent avoiding conflict, trying to stay invisible. She thought about how much she'd let Ethan control her life, even after she'd left him. "Then I'll do it," she said. "I'm done hiding." The next weeks were a whirlwind. She met with federal investigators, handed over documents she hadn't looked at in years. Emails, bank statements, old contracts. Ethan had once shoved across their kitchen counter for her to sign without reading. She sat for hours in a small conference room, telling her story in painstaking detail. It was exhausting, but with every session, she felt lighter. Nathaniel was there for every meeting. He didn't speak unless asked, but his presence was an anchor. He never let her walk into a room alone. The trial date came faster than anyone expected. The government's case against Ethan was airtight. Wire transfers, offshore accounts, witness testimony from former employees. But they needed one more thing. Someone who could speak to his pattern of manipulation and control. That someone was Lila. The courtroom was cold, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Ethan sat at the defense table, his suit immaculate, his hair perfect, but his expression tighter than she'd ever seen it. When she took the stand, her hands trembled at first. She told herself it was nerves, but once she started speaking, the words came easier. She talked about the subtle control, the way he isolated her from friends, the calculated humiliation in public. She spoke about the financial pressure, the contracts she'd been coerced into signing, the charity events she'd later learned were covers for laundering money. Ethan's attorney tried to rattle her, but she didn't flinch. Not this time. When she stepped down, she caught Nathaniel's eye. He gave the smallest nod, pride clear in his expression. The verdict came after only 3 hours of deliberation, guilty on all counts. Ethan's bail was denied. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his face pale, his composure finally cracked. Outside, reporters swarmed. Microphones and cameras pressed in, voices shouting questions. Lila answered only one. "What will you do now that this is over?" She smiled, the kind that came from deep inside. "Live, on my own terms." In the weeks that followed, she kept her word. She took on new design clients, not caring whether they moved in Ethan's circles. She moved to a loft she'd chosen for the light streaming through its big windows, not for its prestige or location. She reconnected with friends she hadn't seen in years, people Ethan had once pushed out of her orbit. One afternoon, she found herself at the same rooftop bar Nathaniel had brought her to before the showdown. He joined her, a glass of something amber in his hand. "Strange to think it's over," she said, gazing out at the skyline. "It's not over," he said, leaning against the railing. "It's just different. You're different." She thought about that. "I guess I am." "You're stronger," he said simply. "And that's not because of me, that's you." She smiled, feeling the truth of it settle in her chest. They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun sink behind the skyscrapers. Finally, Nathaniel spoke again. "You know, when I first saw you at the St. Regis, hugging a stranger to avoid your ex-husband, I thought you were just trying to escape for a moment. I didn't realize you were ready to escape for good." She laughed softly. "I didn't realize it either, but I am now." The wind lifted her hair, carrying away the last traces of the fear that had shadowed her for so long. She wasn't the woman Ethan had broken. She wasn't even the woman who had stood trembling in the lobby of the St. Regis. She was someone new. Nathaniel raised his glass slightly. "To living on your own terms." She clinked her glass against his. "To never going back." As the last light of day bathed the city in gold, Lila knew this wasn't just an ending. It was the start of something she'd once thought impossible. A life that was truly hers. And for the first time in years, she felt completely, absolutely free. So that's it, my friends. Our story has come to an end. But if you're still here, watching until now, then something in Lila's journey has touched you in a way that's hard to ignore. Maybe it's the reminder that, as the Stoics taught, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Or maybe it's the truth that real freedom begins when we stop letting fear make our choices. Lila learned to reclaim her voice, her dignity, and her life, and so can you. If there's one thing you take from this, let it be this. The past does not define you, but the courage you show today will shape your future. Now, if this story moved you, don't just close the video. Like it, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe so you never miss the next journey towards strength and healing.